Good afternoon. I'm John Bell. I work as the Director for Research and Innovation to deliver a healthy planet, so no pressure there. And you're very welcome to this afternoon's session on building a post-COVID food systems economy that works for everybody, people, planet and climate. I'm delighted to be here with a very distinguished panel from across the world. I just want to kick off. We'd like to have some citizen engagement in this process, given that food is our vernacular language. So we're going to be working with Slido. Many of you will be familiar. And we're going to run now very quickly a Slido poll on who is in the room. Normally it's easy enough to get to if you're online. You can go to slido.com if you're coming in through YouTube, where you follow the hashtag RI20. And once inside, just have a look at the first poll, which is who is in the room today, virtually? Okay. We're at a critical moment in our lives here on planet Earth, and it's time for a great transition. We need to change our systems to adapt in terms of our greenhouse gases, how our climate is ready for the future, work within planetary boundaries, work with resource depletion, extreme weather, soil and water, eutrophication of the oceans. And when you look at all of these issues, which is a challenge for our economy and our society, everything depends on food. The food system is right front and center at the heart of all of these. So our food economy and how our food economy works through this transition and how it becomes systemically transformed will determine to a great extent whether we can answer the great question of the next century. Can we reconcile the biosphere with our economy and our society? European Union, as you know, is moving through the gears. Its next great mission is to create a climate neutral continent working within planetary boundaries by 2050. And the President of the Commission last week, in getting ready to be fit for 55, as they call it now, 55% decarbonisation of 2030, means a complete systems change in the way in which we organise, live our lives and allocate our resources and involve people. And if that were not difficult enough, it has to be done in a way that leaves nobody behind. So there we go. That's the dilemma for our panelists this afternoon. I'm sure you'll have a very easy time in answering all of the dilemmas that are inherent there. Food, of course, for Europeans, it's our common language. And a sustainable food system needs to provide the currency of our future European economy and indeed probably the way in which people will interpret the politics of that change. So in the Green Deal, we're now looking at a number of dramatic steps forward. We have the farm to fork strategy, the first major shift in food policy for 25 years. We have a new biodiversity strategy by 2030, zero pollution strategy, climate mitigation strategy, climate adaptation strategy, circular economy strategy. We have the European Union scientific advice mechanism has provided an opinion on what food systems need to be doing, moving more towards a common good than a series of disconnected commodity exchanges. Here in Research Innovation, we've been talking about Food 2030 for some years, where we need a systemic approach delivering co-benefits for nutrition, climate circularity, and most importantly, the places where people live, communities. Because the economy food is the place where the economy, planet and society meet and decisions are taken. The instruments that we have mean that we will be deploying Horizon Europe and its Cluster 6 to develop partnerships, and these new impressive missions we've been talking about today look online about soil, about the future climate adaptation and the ocean systems where food will be central. So research innovation has to set policy, de-risk innovation and demonstrate what is possible in the world we're moving together. It has to be a key enabler with research and innovation in shifting this new policy forward. So the purpose of our session today really is to see whether we can answer four basic questions. How can we build this new post-COVID food systems economy together, delivering on all of these different objectives across sustainability's three pillars? How do we adapt our current day economic model and decision-making processes so that food can be treated as a common good and truly integrate environmental and social and health externalities, that word that is so beloved of people who've been avoiding them for such a long time? And how best to shape future research and innovation policy to help build the food system that we want in 2050. We have to show what the destination is, and we have to show the different pathways to get there, and what is it that research and innovation should be doing, not simply as an observer, but as a driver of what has to happen. And last but certainly not least, in making sure that this includes everybody, what are the new education, training and skills needs that we have to support a system-wide transition across all food systems and nutrition-related sectors, given that about, I think, a fifth or more of the economy is in one way or the other involved in all of this. In the session, we will have a keynote speech, followed by 2 lightning talks by our leading panelists who are leading thinkers and actors in the world of food systems thinking. And for each of the speakers, there will be a Slido poll in the middle of that. So we would ask people to really be hot on the buttons and quick in coming in with your Slido answers so they're in a position to do that. And last but not least, I'm told I have to be extremely strict with the speakers in terms of timing. So I'm not being rude when I warn you that there's a minute to go or therefore, but I'm sure, given that this is about the economy, we can manage supply and demand in the case of time and comment. So before I finish, maybe just have a look at the quick. It looks as if we have around about 50% of people are from the research and university part of our ecosystem, about 18% from public authorities, as distinct from public authority, which is a slightly more intimidating sense. The private sector, great, are there at 17%, and we have non-governmental organisations and others coming in at about 15% between them, with 1% coming from the media. But we'll see how this pans out as we go through. I'd like to shift now to our keynote speaker. I'm delighted that Johan Swinnen, the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, has agreed to come and talk to us today about how we look at the issue of economics. He has a huge experience in economics and agricultural and food policies, and maybe, as this is probably where economics began, in the areas around how agriculture and food and growth and surpluses were all developed, you'll be in a position to put us on the right course, Jo. So I hand over to you, and I thank you very much for joining us. Johan Swinnen, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, for this great introduction. I was asked to start first with the Slido question, and so then people will have the time to think about the answer while I'm giving the rest of my talk. And so the Slido question is as follows. What do you think about the following idea? We need a massive transformation of the food system economy that fully includes environmental and social externalities, combining the concept of planetary and social boundaries. And so there's 5 possible answers. One is that answer A is that this is utopic, this is ideal but impossible to implement. Answer B is it's hard to implement. We cannot put a value on all social and environmental externalities, for example. C, it should be the new normal. Okay, it cannot only be implemented, but it should be implemented. D, it does not make sense. Many businesses will not survive this change and it will put the world economy at risk. And E is conflictual. We live in a globalized world with too many lock-ins. For example, the WTO will never allow it. So those are the 5 options that you can answer. And in the meantime, I will address some of the issues, try to address some of the issues that were laid out here. I mean, the objective of today's session is hugely ambitious. Okay, so these are really difficult questions to answer, and a lot of different questions have been asked. Okay, and so what I will do, I will spend my 8 or 7 minutes left on a couple of on 4 themes, if you want, within. One is I will draw some key lessons from the COVID-19 crisis and how it has affected our food system and the economics of our food system, or our economic thinking about food systems. Second, I will draw implications for the post-COVID food systems and how we should rebuild. The building back better concept is often referred there. Third will be about implications for food policy and for research and innovation policy in particular. And then fourth, I will talk about what this implies for our economics framework, whether we need a new framework, or what are the issues, the key parts on that, key lessons on that. Okay, so let me move on. The first one is, what are key lessons from COVID-19? Well, there's a lot of lessons, okay, but the one which seemed quite relevant or very relevant today is the following. We know now that the impacts of COVID-19 on our food system has been a combination of a standard economic recession, which we know, which we understand very well in terms of the economic models that we have, etc., and a disruption of food systems, which we understand much less. Actually, the best lesson in terms of disruption of food system is probably from the transition of the East European economies in the 1990s, okay, because there the whole food systems were disrupted as well. The big difference between then and now is that at that particular time, it was basically the capital-intensive food systems which were disrupted most because capital constraints were crucial there. What we have today is that it's the labor-intensive food systems are part of the food system, which are mostly disrupted because COVID targets people and targets labor-intensive elements, and also the lockdown is, of course, linked to that. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means essentially that the biggest disruptions are in labor-intensive food systems, and most of these are in developing countries. Okay, we've had specific elements of food system in rich countries, like for some in the meat processing sectors, the harvesting, some of this, but most of the labor-intensive system are in developing countries. It also means that poor people are much more affected than rich people. Okay, so the heterogeneity of the impact is really important. And so why are poor people affected? Because what do poor people have as assets? It's their labor, right? And that's the thing which is affected. Also, poor people spend much higher share of their income on food. And at the same time, their access to food in both also in public supply chain, public distribution system is much more disrupted. A third lesson from COVID, I think, and this comes together with climate change and other factors, is that, we have to start thinking about disruptions as being a rule rather than an exception going forward. What does that imply for our thinking about the economics of post-COVID food systems, okay, for the rebuilding? We have to, there's a couple of things which come up. First of all, our standard economic models do provide interesting insights, right? Because a lot of the impact on people is through declines in incomes, unemployment, increases in the cost of food, poverty effects, etc. We know how these things work. Second, we should not just look at general effects, average effect, but also at the distribution of the effects. And particularly if we look at who is affected, there we see clearly that the distributions are not equal. Okay, it's particular groups in society which are affected stronger. And that also brings back to, for example, the discussion on who can afford nutritious diets in general, not even related to COVID. A lot of big critique on the Eat Lancet diet propositions was that, well, this is all great, but poor people just cannot afford it. Half the planet will not be able to afford the healthy diets which are being proposed. Third, taking a food systems perspective is really important. Okay, so we have to look at this thing not just as looking at the farm, what's produced at the farm, what's produced, what the consumers are buying in the shop. It's an entire system, everything which is in between, even before and beyond. Okay, bring in the food trading companies, the processing, and the retail sector. Everything has to be included, and also the public sector and civil society, etc. And this, of course, links directly, I think, to the farm to fork strategy of the EU right now. Fourth, resilience is crucial to move forward. Okay, and this is something which is now re-emphasized. I mean, people talked about it before, but not really to the extent that we do now. And then, of course, sustainability, it's as important now as it was before. So these implications, I think they fit very well. So the 5 ones I've listed here with the ambitions of the new EU policies, if I want, with the Green Deal, with the farm to fork strategy, which is an essential part of it, and also with, for example, the reform of the common agriculture policy that is currently discussed. And I think that in itself, okay, is already a major achievement, that at least conceptually, the EU has tried to integrate these different policies in a coherent way. Okay, and research and innovation should be at the heart of this. Now, so let's draw a couple of points on for research innovation. I think a crucial thing here is, and this goes back to the concept of a common good. I mean, are these all synergetic? Okay, if we introduce policies, etc., are they going into the same way, or are there trade-offs? And I think in many cases there are trade-offs. And so a lot of our the issues of moving forward is that research and innovation has to help us shift from trade-offs between these sustainability, inclusion, resilience, health objectives towards making them synergetic. Okay, and so research is important to identify where these major trade-offs are. And I think I can give a couple of points, for example, related to the common agriculture policy, all the subsidies that Europe still gives and the trade policies associated with it. Or, for example, all the food standards that the EU imposed on its foods, which have implications for developing countries, how it's affecting the farmers and the consumers there. And these things are explicitly mentioned in the farm to food strategy, which I really like, not just takes an EU focus, but really sees it as sustainability as a global issue. Of course, research not only to understand, but research innovation is to change these things, okay? To move from things which are where there exists a trade-off, trying to reduce the trade-off or try to make them more synergetic. I think issues which have come up with, and so the Horizon programs, etc., are clearly in this thing. The issue which John already mentioned, the important role of partnership, both inside the EU, but also partnerships with the civil society organizations in developing countries or governments of developing countries, etc. I think that is really important, and research institutions there. Two questions: how is COVID-19 affecting the private research and innovation, and how it is affecting public research and innovation? On the private sector, what we see there is that there's a lot of innovation going on right now in the food system, and probably even more in developing countries than in rich countries. And so in developing countries, a lot of companies, both small and large, are trying to see, okay, how can we make changes that basically make us more resilient to these types of change? For example, digitalization, etc., is going on at a pace which is way beyond what people had thought was possible. Also on the public side, there's an issue: will COVID-19 affect the priorities in public spending? Will that undermine the capacities or the objective of spending more on R&D in the agri-food system? I think that's really important. We know that, for example, agricultural research and development, there's been massive underspending for years already, in not just in rich countries, but also in developing countries, if you look from a social perspective, social economic optimum.
Joe, how do you
Last point.
Joe, as the Slido moment has come, if I may intervene, you have a moment to do your last point and the Slido poll.
All right. So the last point is on the what implies it for economics. I think we need really careful, critical thinking moving forwards, and we have to think about the real world and about the relevant questions, and where we put in all these objectives as central and not externalities as a side event, but really as the core of our thing. Okay. So here are the answers. 68% thinks this should be the new normal. Well, I think that's that's more than a 2/3 majority. So this is very encouraging, I think, in terms of how people think about it. And on the one hand, it should. Okay, so that's if you want a normative part of the answer, and also it can be implemented. So it's the positive part of the answer, that they think it is possible. So that's great to hear. I think that's the big lesson here. Thank you.
Bedankt. Thank you, Jo Swinnen. That was a fantastic introduction, covering a huge number of the major questions in a very interesting way that will give us an opportunity to take this discussion forward. We move, and I'm glad to see the majority of people in the room are ambitious as well in terms of moving this agenda and context forward. I'd like to move on now to Dr. Silke Thiele, who's the CEO and Senior Researcher at the Institute for Food and Food Economics in Kiel, who's been leading the transition towards sustainable, healthy and inclusive experiences of food and food economics, as well as in consumption patterns. So maybe, Silke, if I can hand over to you. You're very welcome.
Yes, thank you, John, for the introduction. Due to the tight schedule, I'll start immediately. My slide question for the audience is the following, so it should be shown now. Which government interventions would be most effective in helping people eat healthy and sustainable food? School education on the fields of health and sustainability, taxes on sugar or meat and meat products, subsidies of fruits and vegetables at schools, improving food labeling, stop advertising of unhealthy food, setting standards in restaurants and canteens. That's my questions, and now I'll continue with my talk. So the central objective of the Farm to Fork strategy as a key component of the European Green Deal is to build a fair, healthy and environmentally friendly food system. What exactly does that mean? In my point of view, which is the consumer perspective, it means that all people, independently of their socioeconomic status, age, country and generation, get an easy access to healthy and sustainable food. However, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries, an easy access is often restricted. We are surrounded by offerings of cheap, unhealthy and unsustainable food, which are offered in school canteens, placed at the eye levels of children in the supermarkets, or are promoted in TV programs. This situation leads to the fact that we get much more incentives to eat unhealthy and unsustainable instead of healthy and sustainable food. Sometimes consumers are even completely restricted in their choices. Think of the offerings in school canteens, which are often not consistent with dietary recommendations. As children spend a long time in schools, the meals that they get, they should be in line with the dietary recommendations. In sum, we can say that there is a little supportive food environment, and this seems to have a particular strong impact on people with a lower socioeconomic status because they suffer the most from overweight and obesity and its diet-related diseases. So how can our food environment be improved? In my point of view, we need better government regulations that are able to help people eat healthy and sustainable. However, whenever government regulations are discussed, the question arises as to whether these regulations are justified. From an economic perspective, they are justified for the following reasons. First of all, it can be determined that the current eating habits cause negative externalities, as the economic costs of obesity and related diseases incur not only for the individuals, but for the society as a whole, when there is a social health insurance system. Secondly, due to rising rates of obesity and related diseases, in particular in people with a lower socioeconomic status, inequalities in health are increasing. Not least, we face information asymmetries, as the consumer has less information about the health and sustainability aspects of food than the producer. Consumers have high information costs when planning their diets, and mostly they are completely overstrained with this task. Given that there is market failure in different respects, there's an urgent need for better government regulations. But when planning these interventions, it is very important to scientifically analyze which measures and which designs are most efficient to avoid the risk of policy failure. So supporting research in this area is very essential and my recommendation for R&I. So thank you for that. And exactly the measures were subject of the Slido poll, whose results should be now available. Can you show the results? So yeah, that's interesting. The highest percentage can be attributed to school education in the fields of health and sustainability with 37%. And the next one is taxes on sugar or meat and meat products. So while the first one can be addressed to information asymmetries, the second one addresses the negative externalities. So in my point of view, and so I'm in line with these choices, it is clear that we need different measures addressing the different aspects of market failure because we have failure in different respects. What is unclear, however, is which design of the measures are most efficient. To make it clear what I mean, I'd like to give an example in the area of food taxation to guide food consumption. This form of intervention is already used in some European countries, in Denmark, Finland, France, Hungary, and the UK. But although the goal of these taxes is the same in all countries, the tax schemes are completely different. The object of taxation is different. It's, for example, sugar, fat, soft drinks, junk food, and tax rates differ a lot. Each country tries to reach the same goal in its own way. And the question is, which way is the most efficient? And finding this out should be subject of research. But research is also necessary for all the other measures. It is, for example, unclear how a new food labeling system should be constructed. A new system should be easily understandable and give information on the many health, and increasing health and sustainability aspects of foods. Furthermore, it is unclear what kind of school education we need to achieve the long-term goal of a healthier and more sustainable food consumption. What contents should be taught, and how should the school environment be adapted? These important questions should be scientifically analyzed, and R&I could support this research. So, finally, let me briefly connect to the keynote speech of Joe Swin. He also stressed the importance of evidence-based policies and emphasized that good policy intentions are not good enough. Obviously, previous interventions to counteracting inequalities in the provision of healthy and sustainable foods were not sufficient. This is true for inequalities between developed and developing countries, which was more the focus of Joe Swin's keynote speech. But it is also true for inequalities within developed countries, and that was my focus. So to conclude, R&I could serve as a central foundation to support innovations and research in developing efficient measures in a very broad range. Thank you.
Okay, and you see, Silke, your Slido results, I think, are very much supporting the comments that are there. I mean, you've both raised many issues about the different means to address some of the analysis. One of the things I'm very interested in as we move on is where does behavior come into all of this? I think Jo Swinen was talking about one of the lessons of COVID is that we need to understand a lot more about how behavior functions in a complex and disrupted society, and I'm wondering where that will come in due course. So let me shift over. Thank you very much, Silke. That was very, very helpful in shaping our conversation today. I'd like to shift now over to Dr. Anna. You have to excuse my Irish pronunciation. English is my second language. Dr. Anna Moragues Faus, who's a senior research fellow at the University of Barcelona and a visiting fellow at the Sustainable Places Institute at Cardiff University. And you're here, of course, because of your extensive experience in agri-food systems, economics and governance, as well as food security. And strangely enough, the conversations we're having in climate adaptation now, food security is back front and center in Europe alongside everywhere else. So, Anna, over to you.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today. As my colleagues, I will start with the Slido question. So, my question is, what will be the most transformative action in the food system? A, pay living wages to all workers in the food sector in Europe and beyond. B, significant reduction of meat consumption in Western diets. C, include environmental externalities in food prices. D, rebalance power asymmetries in the food system, mostly to involve the most vulnerable in decision-making. E, ensure physical and affordable access to food for all. Or F, evidence-based, globally aligned food system policies. I move now into my talk, and I will be linking to some of the comments that and some of the key points that Johan has made in his talk. So I do, in order to address this big question of how to build a food economy that works for people, planet, and the climate, I do think that we need a change of paradigm. We need to ensure the right to sustainable food. That is, that every person can have access to food that is healthy and culturally appropriate. And at the same time, that the way that this food is produced, distributed, transformed, consumed, creates prosperity and regenerates the planet, so that the right to sustainable food can be realized now, but also for future generations. I think COVID-19 has exposed the clear interdependencies between food security, health, sustainability, as John was saying now, climate, which shows the impossibility of continue solving food insecurity issues through emergency food aid initiatives and unhealthy foodstuffs with high environmental impacts. At this time, when food insecurity is on the rise across the globe, in the global north and in the global south, it's urgent to devise solutions that are not piecemeal. We don't need any short-term interventions, but actually invest and develop policies that deliver sustainable and just food for all in the long term. Resilience and regeneration are a word that Johan has highlighted. They are not a given. They have to be purposefully nurtured. We need to invest in them. The cost of protecting our planet and our health are high. And what is more, having a food system that partly undermines this planetary health has proven to be very expensive in economic terms, but also in other aspects. So we need to embed this long-term thinking, this resilience when we are valuing economic alternatives. Therefore, I think one of the key issues is to try to invest and facilitate the creation of more distributed food systems that are based on local need and capacities, but that they also assure a fair redistribution of value, knowledge, and power across actors and territories. For me, one of the key things to progress in this agenda is to build on flexible food infrastructure. That means like thinking about material infrastructures, all the markets, all the shops, all the different aspects that made our food systems, but also the social and digital infrastructures, which include the policies that Silke was talking about, and also the new ways that we are connecting amongst each other. It is about seeing our cities and rural areas as places shaped by food and vice versa, and try to be a bit more aware of all this infrastructure that is feeding us. And I think that through COVID, we have seen many initiatives that show how we can repurpose the infrastructure that we have in order to deliver more sustainable food and make sure that people have access to good food. For example, in the case of New York, the school canteens were transformed into grab-and-go points where people can go and get their food. In Wuhan, they were using buses to feed the vulnerable. We had libraries in Toronto as pick-up places for elderly people. Restaurants across the globe were cooking for communities. People's kitchens were turning into places to cook for vulnerable neighbors. And more local agroecological farmers were feeding their communities more than ever by rethinking the way of using this infrastructure that is there, or creating new ways of connecting. So there are innovations that show us that we can only rethink, but actually transform our food system. So I think it's the time to feed the world, but also to build the foundations of the type of world that we want to nourish and create through food these distributive economies that deliver livable and just futures for all. Research and innovation is central to this agenda. And Johan made some points about it, and through our conversations before preparing this session, he made some additional points that I think he wasn't able to make today because of time. But one of the essential things is to work through these interdependencies in the food system, to identify synergies and also work through the difficult trade-offs and embrace complexity. And I would like to add two more key aspects to this research and innovation agenda. I think we need to apply this sustainability and systems thinking to research and innovation processes. We need to work collaboratively and devise ways of working that redistribute value, knowledge, and power as well. This means, among others, embedding much more clearly this concept of justice in our concepts and practices. It has become justice a bit of a fuzzy word. Everybody talks about just food systems, sustainable and just food systems. But I think it's important to reclaim the different dimensions of justice, the economic dimensions in terms of material redistribution, but also the cultural dimension in terms of understanding that there are diverse needs, and the political dimension in terms of who frames what is just, what is fair, and how people participate in the conditions and processes that lead to inequality. So a clear consequence of this is that researchers, we need to engage in co-designing and co-producing research agenda and processes and engage with diversity. And my last point, and it echoes some of the things that John was saying through our conversations, is that we need real economic thinking applied to the world today. I completely agree with that. I think we need to build common visions, but work particularly hard on how transitions are going to happen. What are the steps needed? I think we need to assume that there's a bumpy road ahead and that conflict is part of many processes of change. And one of the things that COVID-19 has shown us is that we can take bold and unprecedented action. Policies and measures we never think of were implemented through this time. And also people were taking care of each other by incredible collective efforts. So the limits of what is possible are today much more blurred than a year ago, and we need to push for this transformative action at all levels. And I think now I can look at the Slido question and see what transformative actions people will go for. So one of the key things that have been discussed, I think, in many forums about include these environmental externalities in food prices has been the most important one. meat is high in the agenda, and I think it's like an illustration of this type of conflict. So that's the second one, the significant reduction of meat consumption. 21% of people went for that one. But also this idea that evidence-based and global aligned food system policies are the route for change. So I think this is a great call for policymakers, but also practitioners, to work hard towards doing this. We can build this together, that's for sure. All of them had some contributions, so I think all of them are regarded to be important. But yeah, I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
That's great, Anna. Just the last point you were talking about in the Slido, do you think non-researchers know what externalities in food prices mean?
Well, I think maybe not. There were a lot of researchers in the room, but I suppose it's just maybe to clarify, it's introducing all the costs that are part of all the environmental, like measuring all the costs, environmental cost of like producing and distributing and transforming food into the food prices, so we can have a better picture of the actual cost and how this impacting our resilience. So I hope if people don't know, there's a lot of literature in this, and I think that is a good place to be looking at.
That's very helpful, because I think one of the things we're hearing a lot today when we look at the different transitions, a lot of people haven't been able to add up all the different things that they know to be true to form the picture of what the actual dilemma is. And I think COVID, as Jo has pointed out, has quite starkly removed a lot of the confusion around some of the really big opportunities and challenges that are there. That's very helpful. So, Jo and Swinnen, coming back to you, you've heard now some responses and some answers in terms of what you set out to achieve. You talked at the beginning about what this new resilience looks like and the different elements. I mean, in terms of what we've been hearing for the last while, where would you come in terms of where do we start on this? Where does the how begin?
Well, I think where to begin is, sorry, I have a bit of feedback here. Where to begin is, I think it's crucial if you look right now in that we take a very hard look on how disrupted our food systems have been by COVID-19, for example. And I think the answer to that is much less clear than what people argue it to be in all kinds of public discussions. It seems to be that COVID-19 is now used by those who are against global food chains to say local is the answer, and the ones who believe in global food chains who say, well, you see, these global food chains have actually been pretty resilient. And so I think the answer is actually very mixed on that and much less obvious than think. And so this brings back to evidence-based policies in terms of we got to be very careful in analysis. The other thing is that innovation, okay, I think Anna made a great story about giving all these examples about innovation taking place. She gave a lot of examples from, I would say, partly the public sector or cooperatives and things like local. I emphasize some of the stuff which is going on in the private sector, but everywhere it's going on. And so things are possible now which just were not even thought of being possible before COVID, okay? And I think the opportunity for making big changes now is huge, and we should really use this, okay? And so in that way, also moving towards resilience is just to use the opportunity to introduce things now which otherwise would not be possible.
Silke, in your point of view, when you look at, you take a word like education and what it means and how you move it forward, how do we educate people, all of us, all ages and groups, for a world in which resilience is going to be a way of life and not a policy? Where would we start?
Yeah, we should start to implement a new subject at schools, for example, and to teach the children when they go to school that we need an easy access for all people to healthy and sustainable food, and that is important. I think it is very important when we have more measures, as I said, like government interventions, then it is the taxpayers have to pay for it. So when we, for example, when when we implement measures like giving children free fruit and vegetables at schools, for example, it has to be paid by the taxpayer. So, and it is very important to take all the people on board that they support this idea that we need an easy access, as I said, to healthy and sustainable food. And I think the easiest way is to start with the children at school. And so we need school subjects that are and that is important, and it should be taught from the beginning when children come to school to the end of their school life. And that is very important, I think. But this school education, I think, is a measure which is a long-term measure, I think. So it takes a while that we convince all people or more people that we need to consume healthier and more sustainable, and that is a long-run measure. And I think we also need short-run measures. So we need different measures at the same time, I think.
Thank you very much. I mean, Anna, you were talking about this. I think the examples you gave, I think, really struck a chord for all of us. We're all balcony people now after COVID. And actually, it was the food runs where I live in Brussels as well. It was the food runs that connected everybody back up, people you'd never met before. There's something very hopeful. I think Jo was mentioning it in an intellectual framework, that there is a hope, a possibility that is there, but there is a narrative that needs to be in some way started, that it is possible that we can move from optimism to hope, and the difference between optimism and hope, as you know, is a good plan. And what we need is to have places, chantiers, places to experiment, places to test these new forms of resilience and ways of life. We need new knowledge, we need it applied. Maybe for you, in terms of moving towards the end of the session, where would you start? If there was one thing, I'm going to ask each of you, if there's one thing you were asking the fairy wizard of research and innovation that can do anything from blue skies through to deployment and large-scale demonstrators, what would be the first thing you would do, let's say in a European context, as a starting point to move this transition forward on the ground?
I do think I completely agree with you, John, of the importance of this experimentation and having this capacity of like scaling up these ideas. And I do think that it has been very interesting how communities have stepped up to actually take care for each other, because that was what COVID was about, caring for others and making sure that others were all right. And how through that process, there's a lot of innovation in communities, but there's a lot of limitations in terms of what infrastructure they have in material terms, but also in social terms and so on. So I do think that spaces of experimentation where we can get some of that digital infrastructure, that social infrastructure, and also some of the material infrastructure where maybe the public sector can also see how they can support communities without maybe taking over and allowing those connections to flourish in the way that they do. I think that kind of like type of experimentation and having the resources to see how we can scale up and out these initiatives to actually start transforming the food system and building this redistributive approach, which I think is very important, how we redistribute value, how we redistribute knowledge. I think that would be very important, though, very, very interesting. And I know that communities and these initiatives are like looking for ways of continuing, of like trying to keep on their work. So having that type of support and being able to share it and to scale it up and out and deep if necessary, that would be great.
Deep demonstration lighthouses. That's one done. We have 1.5 minutes here. So very quickly, Silke, your one thing you'd like us to do.
So I think it's very important that scientific research is supported in these different measures to find new designs of measures, which bring us to a healthier and more sustainable food consumption.
Great. Okay, and last word, Jo Swinton, I give the last word to you. Where would you start? First thing tomorrow, research innovation.
Well, I mean, Yeah, I don't really believe in one thing changing the world, but if I right now, since this is the European Commission organizing this, right?
Yeah.
And I worked for a long time on European Commission policies, and you have the Green Deal, the Farm to Fork strategy, cap reform, all happening. Thinking about it consistently, that's a major thing. Now think about the implementation and the enforcement of these things going in the same direction. That would be fantastic.
Okay, so let's do that. Let's do it in the missions, the partnership, Horizon Europe. Thank you very much. It's been a great session. We will meet again and talk again. Thank you. Bye-bye.